Hey everyone, welcome to My Two Cents with Tawanda Harris. This is a podcast dedicated to educators, for educators, and by educators. Yes, it's all about encouraging, it's all about sharing strategies, it's all about going on an educational journey with each other. You are not alone, and I hope that when you finish listening to this podcast, you feel like you went on a journey with educators around the world. Thank you for tuning in to My Two Cents. Okay, so we're so excited to have the dream team. I don't know how can I explain how awesome the both of you all are, Kass and Corn, today on the My Two Cents podcast. We're going to jump right in, and we're going to start now with your teacher journey. Can you share with the folks your teacher journey?
Yeah, I'll pitch it to Kass. I mean, we met at school, so we very much have the same journey. Yeah.
Similar, yeah. I think it's interesting to also think about, like, before Corn and I met, we were both kind of like operating in like different entities. So I started my career out in Chicago. At the University of Chicago, I worked at this nonprofit. And so my job was to like employ tutors from the University of Chicago and like put them in different places on the South Side. And so I just saw so many enlightening things in schools on the South Side. So for folks who haven't been there, it's literally like 99.5% Black African-American student populations. And then there was like me and my 21-year-old white self from the Midwest. And it's like, you go from you think you know everything. And it was a really, really like humbling experience. So I brought that with me and then I moved to New York City and I joined like the New York City Teaching Fellows. And that's where I met Cornelius at a school in downtown Brooklyn that we made a lot of special memories there. But I was a 23-year-old special education teacher teaching 21-year-old 11th and 12th graders, my first year of teaching. It was wild. I learned so much. And then a lot of things happened. And then I spent my last 5 years of teaching in a neighborhood called Sunset Park deep in Brooklyn. I taught 4th and 5th graders. And so that's sort of like my inside school-based experience as classroom teacher.
That's like a huge extreme. So you said you were teaching seniors and then you went to the elementary space?
I did. I have a license that no longer exists, probably for good reasons. So my licensure is middle childhood special education, and it's like grades 5 through 9. And in New York State, you can teach 1 under or 1 over. And so when you get to 9th grade, if you're teaching in a high school, they will put you wherever. And at the time, and I mean, now we have a teacher shortage like nothing we have ever seen. But, New York City has always been like starving for teachers, especially like in special education and science. And so they just threw me in there and they're like, girl, you just do you. And I was like, okay. I learned a lot though. It's where a lot of my teacher agency comes from, is because I was always having to make decisions on my own. Yeah. So yeah. And then Corn was the teacher upstairs with the cute little fuzzy bunny.
Yeah. So Kass was teaching 9th grade the year that we like connected. And you had a 12th grade advisory in my room. Yeah. So I was the weird teacher. Like I've always been the weird one. So like there was always something ridiculous happening in my classroom. So we'd be building skateboards. We would be like knocking down walls to make room for like a science area. So it was always something weird going on. And I took my kids on a field trip to an animal shelter in the Bronx one day. That's when I was in the Bronx, and they were like, yo, Mr. Minor, like this rabbit is real cute. We should adopt this rabbit. And so I'm on a field trip in the middle of this field trip, and the kids hustle me into adopting a rabbit. And I remember talking to the lady at the place, and the lady was like, well, the rabbit has been abused, so you're going to need to nurse it back to health. This rabbit probably won't live that long. So if you adopt it, you can work really hard and you won't have the rabbit for too long. And so I was like, bet, I'm not going to have the rabbit for too long. That rabbit lived for 13 years. So that
rabbit lived long into our marriage.
So that rabbit was in my classroom, chilling, refusing to die, not going anywhere. But it was amazing, because there's something about like cultivating life. And there's something about looking at a thing that has been written off, and forming the kind of community that can support that thing into longevity, and so that rabbit became a metaphor for what I was trying to do in books. That rabbit became a metaphor for what I was trying to do in writing. And so that's how we met. Like, so Kass's advisory would meet in my room, and her like grown seniors would like be like brushing my rabbit.
They would brush Jeffrey, but then they started bringing a lint roller because, it's Brooklyn and they're trying to lick their, to the nines. So they would like brush the rabbit, and then they would like, lint roll their clothes. We don't want to like, funny fuzz on themselves.
Yeah. But, Kass and I always say that, like, we had, and we're from a different era, right? Like right now, this era is defined by mandate and compliance and demands that teacher conform to like different things, and we're from the era where they were like, you know what, like if you love kids and you alive and you got something to offer, we need you in New York City. And so in so many ways, we were given kind of creativity and flexibility to do our thing that, I often give credit to our first principal. I remember once sitting in her office and she asked me, she's like, Cornelius, why are you on this planet? Like, what is your gift? And I was like, well, I like skateboarding. I think I'm really good with like, young men. And she was just like, then how are we writing this into what you do in this institution? And so I taught, a physics course for seniors, but through the lens of skateboarding. And so we skateboarded all over New York City. I took kids to New Orleans post Katrina, and we like did service and activism and skateboarding, and she made a lot of that possible. She's like, if this is your gift on the planet, why aren't you giving it to children through this institution? And so I think Kass and I came up in this way where nobody ever told us no for like the first decade of our career, where if it was a thing that we could imagine and we could hustle to get it done, then we did it,
Yeah. That's pretty deep. It's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about my first year teaching and my principal, and she would allow me to do a lot, but it was more so I was allowed to do those things because my test scores were high. And it was like, man, like, wow, that's where your autonomy came. Like, if you could prove that your children, your students could score high on this test that measured one part of who they were, then you had the privilege to explore other things. And I'm thinking, wow, how unfair that is, how, because there were teachers that did not produce high test scores that were amazing teachers, and they literally would walk into first and foremost connect with students. But because their test scores weren't where they needed to be, then administrators were in their rooms constantly. They were asked to, what lesson are you on? What are you doing? And I remember my mentor teacher, I would do her, it was funny. Now this is hilarious. We had to do bulletin boards, right? And so we would get like a grade, which is like the silliest thing ever. So we would have a score. And so like every Friday or whenever we had to put up new bulletin boards, there was a sheet, a rubric, and we would get a score on it. And so my mentor teacher, she was amazing at connecting with her students. There was such a community. When you walked in, you felt like you were breaking bread with the students. Lunchtime, oh, there was a circle time going to happen in there, and they would run the whole thing. Well, she was horrible at doing her bulletin boards. So the deal was, all right, fine, we're a team. There are 5 of us. This is what I'm going to do. We would see administrators walking around. We're running down. We would make double of everything. Okay, we'll cut out a set of this, and this is what we're doing. And I'm literally like stapling and putting it around and all of that stuff. And then finally they walk around and they give us a grade. No problem. She's still able to connect with her students and she got a good score. But when you think about that, how like backwards, like how backwards
absolutely
is that?
That's wild. It's interesting. Like, so as a special educator, like I've taught in a lot of different realms, right? And so I've taught general education a little bit, but my time has mostly been spent like through the lens of working with children who are really operating at really different, they're thinking really differently than a lot of their peers. And so one of the things that I always had to work for was sort of like that recognition or affirmation that a lot of other teachers get by having high test scores. Because working in like a special class in a community school, children are not going to produce like whatever scores that are shiny or look golden to school administration. So from very early in my career, I was just like, well, this is just not part of my paradigm. Like, I just can't even pay attention to this metric as part of my self-worth. So I feel like really blessed in a lot of ways because that was just never part of my, literally, like it didn't enter my mental stream. So my last few years of teaching, I'm so proud of them because I was working with a group of 12 students who had all kind of like the world, like so many barriers. But we did really, really rich and great work. And part of what I really learned to do was like, I mean, people think it's corny to talk about this stuff, but when I'm talking about like activating prior knowledge, like operating from kids' schema, like hovering around that zone of proximal development, I got really, really good at that because there was no other option for me. And so then that's when you get other people like peeking in your room, oh, what are they doing? And it's like, well, I'm meeting kids where they're at. And I have high expectations of them, right? And so that's something that I feel really proud of. And that's something I'm not sure I would have really like developed so early on in my career if I had students who were scoring really highly on exams.
Yeah, and we were encouraged to think that way. Again, we had this amazing school. We were a member of a consortium of several schools in New York City where we didn't even subscribe to standardized tests. So our kids didn't sit for them. We came up with in-house standardized assessments where kids would essentially do a dissertation on a topic to like prove that they had met proficiency. And then there would be community members and people, who worked at the school who would be on your committee. And so like with a bunch of my kids, we built a skate park. And that's how we were able to demonstrate knowledge of physics. That so you have
just
to
clarify, because lots of people will be listening in this podcast. So just to clarify, Cornelius is talking about the Coalition of Essential Schools, and there's a bunch of group of schools called the Consortium. And so I don't know if this is still true, but back then, if you were in high school, you had to take the math regions, which is like Common Core standards, whatever standardized test your state has, the math and ELA test, you did have to sit for. But for science and social studies and things like physics or any other standardized courses, you essentially had, like Corn is talking about, like a high school dissertation project that took place of those tests.
And so I spent a lot of time really thinking about what does this subject area mean in the world and in your community, and how can we bring it to life through what you do every day. And so kids solve real problems, and that was how we measured proficiency. And then they had to show those solutions to members of the community, and they had to pass that test. And so when you got to explain to auntie how you understand this physics, that's a whole different kind of stress, that's but kids rose to that, and so so bubbling in answers on a sheet wasn't a thing that I learned to think about, and it wasn't a thing that I learned to fear. Right. So if we can build a skate park, I can tell you that gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. That ain't nothing, and so like that kind of stuff was like really fun for us. And it has kind of left its impact. So even though we don't work that way anymore, like when people start throwing scores and metrics, I'm just like, but what can kids do? And how do we know? Right. That, like you said earlier, that these examinations are one day of a kid's, 180. Right. And so this idea that and we all know the danger of a single story, and that's what a test is. It's a single story. It's a snapshot of that one day. Right. And so whenever one is presented with a single story, the way that you undo that damage is you tell counter stories. And so I always ask, like, what are the counter stories? What other kinds of assessments? How am I going to show kids mastery in other ways? And so
So you all talked, you both talked a little bit about your classroom and your students. So I want you to just describe for me how your students would describe your classroom.
Wow. It's a lot.
Go ahead, Corn. Go ahead.
I mean, we shared so many of the same students. So I think that they would call it home, and we're still in touch with a lot of them. Right. And so, like, I know Kass is a lot more organized than I am. And so Kass's situation was a lot it was like, Kass had her ducks in a row. My situation, like I have always just like lived in like the beauty and the majesty of chaos, right? And so
balance.
yeah.
It's always a balance. And it's interesting. I remember, so like my last day of like classroom teaching before I started working at Teachers College was like, anybody who's left like a school community, like knows what it means to like leave kind of like what might be your last group of kids within a school. And I remember we did like this activity where we're all like kind of like leaving like, markers of like memories and things like that. And they told me, they're like, well, you're really silly, but you're also like very serious. And I think that's like a good describer, like a good description of my teaching persona. It is like, Tawanda, I imagine this of you too, like those really high expectations that come with the level. I mean, for me, it's like, look, kiddos, you got to get your stuff together because life, life ain't no crystal stair. Like that's real.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But but the other thing I always carry with me is like, we're going to have a good time learning these things and we're going to have a good time being together. Like you cannot, like school, unfortunately right now, just given this landscape of so many variables, like the pandemic, COVID, just staffing shortages, like I worry how kids are feeling about showing up to school. Like what is their daily experience like? Many of us are in communication with teachers and we know how hard it is for them right now. So, there's just like a lot of things that are whirling around in my mind.
Absolutely.
We try to navigate our now.
Yeah. And that worry is a worry that I've always harbored. I was a student who didn't have a great time in school, right? And so I've always thought about how can I literally make every second of our existence in this classroom a powerful experience for you? And so I was always armed with a poem. I always had stories to tell. I always had a book in my back pocket. Like every...
I have to pause. We have to tell them. So when we were teaching, we have so many stories. This is fun to wonder because we don't often get to see these stories. So when I was teaching with Corn in our school, those first few years, like Cornelius was known for this poem that he performed in the cafeteria. And you're going to laugh and probably not be so surprised, but it was literally called the Chicken Nugget poem. This poem was literally about a piece of chicken. I'm not even kidding you. It was about a piece of chicken, and the children, these seventh graders, these like just beautiful Brooklyn seventh graders thought, however they were outside of school, when they heard Cornelius like say this poem, you saw them be children again. And it was like the most beautiful thing. And, as I recount like my falling in love with Cornelius, is one of like the strongest imprints in my mind, like witnessing children see this man goofy as all get out, talk about chicken nugget, and like it's a poem and it's literacy and it's all the things that you want for your own child to experience in school.
Yeah. And even today, yeah. I mean, today we were waiting on the bus and the bus was late today. So like there's a bus that's supposed to come get the kids and take them home. And the bus didn't show up for like 30, 40 minutes after school. And so I'm standing in the schoolyard and I just started telling stories. And then like all these kids just gather around and listen to the story, like, and I didn't have not a single book, not a sheet of paper, but I'm like, all right, what's your name? All right, Kevin, this story is about King Kevin. And like, just starting to tell stories, and so, but that's always been like, if we have a moment where I can capture your imagination, even if it's 2 minutes while we wait on a bus, if we have a moment where I can like have you think about something that you've never thought about before, I'm going to take that moment, because like, every second I'm in a classroom is an opportunity, like, and I know this sounds super cliche, but it's an opportunity to catalyze something great in another human. Right. And so like, why would we waste that? And so like, I remember even before the pandemic, one of the things I was trying to teach myself was how to make balloon animals. I was just like, if I'm in the lunch line and the lunch line mad long, I need to make a balloon animal so that people gonna have something to do. So they don't tear the cafeteria.
Clown skills, we all need them as teachers. Yeah.
All of that stuff, like magic tricks, balloon animal, like all that stuff. Cause like, even, I got good at even like the interim time, I used to like make up rhymes with kids in the stairwell on the way to the cafeteria. And so like I was on the 3rd floor and the cafeteria was in the basement. And so that's 3 flights of stairs that you're going down. That's about 7 minutes of time that you got with kids. Now you could be quiet and be screaming at them to stay in line, or you can have mad rhymes and they'll stay in line because they want to hear what you have to say, you know? And so like every moment, like, and so when I think about like describing my classroom, I don't think I can describe my classroom. Rather, I can describe my existence, right? Like that this is how I want to exist in community with children. So
it's funny though, because I think, and so Wanda, you might feel like this too. I think about like, you know, for me as a teacher, it was all about creation. It was about imagining. It was about like discovering. And for Corn, he was like the book guy. He was like reading with kids all the time. And then we reflect. We're like, how do we get to this place where we're telling like whole districts like how to be? And we're just like, honestly, like all I want to do is like make stuff with kids. Like all Corn wants to do is like read with kids. And it's like, what happened to this landscape where we are now in these positions where,
well, and I think, you know, it's really helping educators to understand that it's not a this or that, but it's a this and that. Like it's all connected, you know, it beautifully just weaves together in a student's learning experience. And so if we're not showing them how this learning connects to them, as well as connects to their world, then they're going to see this as a worksheet that I just need to finish, or I just need to finish this assignment, or did I get an A? I don't care, you know, what the process was of me getting this A. Did I get an A because I need to show my parents that I am getting good grades? It's like, how do we shift students from this way of thinking of I need to complete a task versus this is going to help me be a better human?
Well, I think the answer is like, we don't shift students, we shift ourselves first. Right. Like if you want to change the world, you start from your corner, right? That's Big Boy from Outkast, Humble Mumble, right? Like, and so this idea, And so I think we stay looking at kids talking about, well, I want kids to value the learning process. I want kids to value what's important. But then when we look at ourselves, we the main ones chasing scores, right? And so we can't desire what we don't embody. You know, and so I'm really all about that. Like it has to be, and all the work that Kass and I are doing right now is inner work with teachers. That like when you have a strong core, these winds that blow in education don't shake you, you know. And so,
and that's real, because you know I had the same exact conversation with a group of teachers last week, and you know they were talking about the pressure to like plow through curriculum and like how it's coming from families. And you know, we named it. I was like, y'all, like it's atmospheric. It is in the atmosphere. And so the thing that you can lean on, the only thing that you really have control over is like how you are internalizing, interpreting those energies that are coming for you. And so I believe the best thing we can do for teachers and with teachers is to equip them with that agency that the three of us like built in our bellies long, long ago, and it has never quite left us. But I don't know. I see, you know, just all of the things, policies, COVID, it's just really impacting teacher agency and their ability to feel confident in making those calls for their kids.
I've been doing I've been having way too much fun with these TikToks. Like, I feel like it's a great day for me. So I am like, you know, at first I'm like, oh, let me just get a certain amount of followers so I can go live. I got the followers and now I don't go live. I'm just having fun over there. So, you know, I'm over there. But what is so interesting is I get to, there's no like polish behind your videos. I could throw a hat on and shoot a TikTok. I could be in my bedroom and shoot a TikTok. Like there's like no criteria of what you can shoot, how you can shoot a TikTok. But what the benefit that I find is with the TikToks, I get direct access to how teachers are feeling. Like directly. There's no protocols in place. There aren't any, you know, they say what they need to say and that's it. But what I'm finding is I'm going through, and of course with music and having a little bit too much fun and pulling my daughter in at the same time, but I'm doing this and I'm putting like little nuggets in there in my TikToks. And we're talking about 60 seconds, you know, after 60 seconds, the attention is lost. but they are so engaged with what it is because it's almost like no one's talking about how to fill their toolbox on how to center students in the classroom, how to center their experiences. Because, like you said, Cass, we're talking about curriculum. Like, how do we get through this? How many standards can we teach? All of that. And it's like, yeah, that's great, but that's a piece. That's a small piece
Yeah.
of, what we want our students to be.
And it's not a surprise that we have to find inspiration outside of school, right? That's not surprising. One of the things, our great friend Marcus Harden, one of the things that he says all the time to us is that you can't heal in the same place that made you sick, right? And so we're at school, like engaged in all of this toxic behavior that is making educators sick, that has been making kids sick, been making kids with disabilities, queer kids, Black and brown kids, poor kids, right? Has been making kids sick. And so that teachers are turning to TikTok, to Twitter, to Facebook groups to find ways to heal is not surprising. And I think for a big, for Kass and I, our work is really thinking about how do we reclaim these spaces that have been colonized away from us, right? The school is no longer the place where you can do your healing, but it can be still, and we believe that. And so a big part of our work is that kind of both internal and institutional transformation that has to happen so the school can be a place of healing again. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so you recently retweeted. I went back. You tweeted this last year. It was 2020. And oh my goodness, it's kind of like timeless. Like, I think I retweeted your retweet. It was just like a timeless tweet. But I'll read it really quickly and we'll just kind of have some conversation around this. You said the world was upside down, but I was ready because I read books. So can we kind of talk about or have a conversation around how, this shows up in our students' literacy lives or just
Absolutely.
the impact?
Absolutely. I think all the time, first of all, like I have never really been a great student. Like, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks a lot about how he says, I was built for a library, not necessarily a classroom. And I think that applies aptly to me, that I don't do well in classrooms. If I have to go, like, I'm the worst student, but you put me in a library where I can read and find my own stuff. And, like that stuff is amazing, and so one of the things that I think a lot about is everything that we're experiencing right now. And I'm using the words of Gil Scott-Heron, the poet, right? Ain't no new thing, right? People have suffered in these ways before. Ain't necessarily been pandemic, but our communities have been deprived of resources before, right? Like it hasn't necessarily been, police shootings or gentrification, but our communities have had our rights compromised before, right? And so I always want to think like this pain that I am feeling, this discomfort that I am feeling, who has felt it before and how did they navigate it, right? And so for me, the answer always been in books, right? And so when pandemic hit and people are like, oh my gosh, we don't know what way is up, I'm like, but Elaine Brown knew when she led the Black Panthers. So let me read and see what she got to say, right? Audre Lorde knew when she was writing Sister Outsider. So let me read and see what she got to say. Sun Ra knew when he was composing music that was out of this world, literally. So let me see what he's got to say. And so I just really believe that, like, I don't have to wait for somebody to give me the answer when there are people who have already committed the answers to page, right? And so I've gotten really good at teaching myself, okay, like, I've been thinking a lot about Sun Ra and his orchestra. I'm a huge jazz fan, right? And so Sun Ra kind of comes into jazz and he's just like, I'm going to turn it all in a different direction. And I'm going to honor both ancestors and the cosmos. And I'm going to help people to feel something real again. This thing that has been commercialized, I want to help people feel something real again. I'm like, well, that's what I want to do in school, right? This thing that has been taken over by the testing industrial complex, this thing that has been co-opted by Pearson or any number of these companies, right? Like, I want people to feel something real again. So why can't I read how Sun Ra did that in jazz and apply that to what I'm doing in a classroom? And so really that's where it comes from, that I don't think that there is a problem that we face that somebody hasn't faced before in some other like way, right? And And so I get excited by that, like that we have so many elders and ancestors who have answered these questions and grappled with these problems before, right? And so I just want to see how they did it. And I think that that's how we honor them, right? That people are always, we're about to have Indigenous Peoples Day come up, right? And so how do we honor those many, many ancestors whose lives were taken violently from them? How do we honor those folks whose lands were stolen from them? Well, we honor them by, like, one of the ways that we honor them is by kind of like learning lessons, and not just learning them, but then living them. And so that gets exciting for me.